The Shroud of Turin is the most studied artifact in human history. It is a piece of linen cloth that bears the image of a man who has been crucified. We know this by the blood flow from the wrists and ankles. There are also trickles of blood around the head. The body has blood all over it from what appear to be whip marks. In 1998, the Shroud of Turin was publicly displayed in Turin for 8 weeks. Time magazine asked, "Is it Jesus?" This presentation will demonstrate, there is powerful evidence, that corroborates that the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. It is a rectangular linen cloth measuring approximately 4.4 meters by 1.1 meters. It is kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, since 1578. The image on the shroud can only be seen if someone stands about 6 feet, or 2 meters distant from it. In the front image, one can see a face framed by long hair and a thick beard, the chest, and the arms crossed over the pubis with legs extended. The back image shows the nape, the back, legs extended, and the soles of the feet. The shroud is made of fine linen, with a characteristic herringbone weave. On enlargement, the herringbone weave can be clearly recognized. According to the Gospels, Jesus was beaten, his beard ripped off, scourged, crowned with thorns, then he carried his cross, and was nailed to the cross, died, and pierced by a spear by a Roman soldier. In Luke 22 verses 62 to 65 we read, "The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, 'Prophesy. Who hit you?' And they said many other insulting things to him." On the shroud, we see a large hematoma on his right cheek, probably a broken nose, and most remarkably, in Isaiah 50:6b it says, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard." This is a messianic prophecy. Nowhere do the Gospels mention that the Roman soldiers pluck off his beard, but on the shroud we can clearly see a part of his beard missing. The man on the shroud bears numerous contusive injuries that have been carefully studied by forensic doctors. The right side of his face appears more swollen than the left, with visible hematomas and contused lacerations. Numerous sinuous bloodstains can be seen on his forehead, the back of his neck, and throughout his hair, emanating from small wounds with pointed diameters. These stains radiate out from his head in a spoke-like pattern, suggesting that a helmet of sharp, pointed thorns was pressed onto his head. The sinuous bloodstains on his forehead, neck, and hair suggest that the subject had a helmet of thorns pressed onto his head, causing small pointed wounds. The spoke-like pattern of the stains radiating from the head indicates the uniformity of the injury, possibly caused by the same object. The characteristics of the bloodstains allow for distinguishing between injuries to arterial and venous vessels. The bloodstain on the center of the forehead flowing from a wound in the frontal vein is particularly interesting as it takes on the shape of an inverted 3, as it follows the contours of the forehead. This type of bloodstain pattern can be useful in identifying the direction and force of the injury. The abrasions on the chest, back, and lower limbs consisting of round, approximately 2 centimeters long figures suggest injuries caused by a flagellum, a Roman torture instrument consisting of a wooden handle with cords at the end to which small metal balls were attached. The punishment was inflicted on a bent back and naked body, causing over 100 such injuries. The detailed examination of the bloodstains and injuries on the subject's body provides valuable insights into the manner of his death and the torture he endured. At the height of the left scapular area and the right suprascapular area, quadrangular bruises can be observed. These marks are believed to have been left by the patibulum, the horizontal beam of the cross that the condemned sometimes carried on himself to the place of execution. The object was likely heavy and rough, causing the bruises to be quadrangular in shape. The long bloodstains on both forearms that appear to run upwards are actually formed when the body was hung on the cross, and therefore the wrists were higher than the elbows. The characteristic bloodstain on the left wrist formed by two divergent streaks is particularly noteworthy as it indicates two different positions assumed by the condemned on the cross. The blood flows from an oval-shaped wound caused by a pointed instrument, such as a nail. Particular attention should be paid to the location of this wound, which is not in the palm of the hand as depicted in the traditional iconography of crucifixion, but in the wrist. Following is a point of interest, namely in every single medieval painting of Jesus' crucifixion, the nails are always in the center of the palm. Yet we know now based on the physical structure of the bones in the hand that a nail in that location would simply rip out through the fingers. It would not sufficiently carry the weight of the crucifixion victim. Interestingly, the shroud is different from every piece of medieval artwork in this detail in that it places the nails at the wrist. Not only is this different, but it's also physiologically possible. That means that the shroud is more medically and physiologically accurate than every piece of medieval crucifixion artwork. The content of the shroud is consistent with the biblical passion narrative. Interestingly, the shroud is different from every piece of medieval artwork in this detail in that it places the nails at the wrist. Not only is this different, but it's also physiologically possible. That means that the shroud is medically and physiologically more accurate than every piece of medieval crucifixion artwork. It is noteworthy that the image of the thumbs is absent from the shroud, which could be due to damage to the median nerve or tetanic contraction. On the right side of his chest, there is a large bloodstain that flows from an oval-shaped wound caused by a pointed and sharp object that struck between the fifth and sixth ribs, penetrating deeply. The characteristics of this wound indicate that it was inflicted after the man's death. Jesus was crucified without clothing. He was flogged. He had a crown of thorns placed on his head. He was slapped and beaten in the face, and his beard was ripped off. Jesus' legs were not broken. His hand, feet, and side were pierced. The man in the shroud had developed rigor mortis. The forearm blood flow was consistent with outstretched arm held up and out. The thumbs were flexed due to nerve damage at the wrist. The mid-torso blood flow was post-mortem and originated from a major artery or organ. And the man carried a heavy load on his shoulders after the initial scourging. All of these details only further expand on the correlation between the content of the shroud and the biblical passion narrative. All the wounds that can be seen on the Shroud of Turin coincide with the ones described in the Gospels, inflicted on Jesus. How was the image on the shroud made? It's not a painting. If this were true, it should be possible to identify the pigments used by chemical analysis, just as conservators can do for the paintings of old masters. But there is no evidence of any pigments on the cloth in sufficient amounts to explain the image. Nor are there any signs of it being rendered in brush strokes. Can you imagine that a talented artist would have painted the image, on the right, and would have obtained by an extraordinary chance the wonderful highly realistic image, which is in fact related to the unique three-dimensional characteristic of the shroud image, seen on the right, the negative photograph, without having in mind even the possibility to imagine such effect? The shroud image is not created by any paint stain or dye. It's not due to oil or bodily composition. It's not caused by acid powder or heat. Interestingly, there's no material, whether organic or inorganic, deposited on the shroud to form the image. The image does not crack at the fold lines, and there's no difference in spatial distribution when viewing the image in the infrared spectrum when compared with the visible spectrum, a feature present in brushed paintings. If we look closely at the threads of the shroud themselves, we observe an interesting phenomenon. Each thread consists of many microscopic fibrils. And in the blood-stained areas of the shroud, the blood wicks through all of the fibrils by capillary action, meaning we can see the blood stains on the back of the shroud. However, the image is present only on the topmost fibrils, indicating a lack of capillary action. And this is interesting because it is not physically possible to apply any sort of liquid paint, stain or dye to the shroud without it wicking through to the back side through capillary action, so we know for certain that the image could not have been formed through any sort of liquid applied to the surface. The entire image is very superficial in nature, around 0.002 of a millimeter only on the uppermost surface of the fibrils. The inner side is not, thus it could not have been formed by chemicals. The image resides on the outermost layer of the linen fibers. The image was not made by a natural chemical process. The image is the result of oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the fibers of the shroud themselves. It is like the imaged areas on the shroud suddenly rapidly aged compared to the rest of the shroud. The image on the shroud is the only one of its kind in this world, and there are no known methods that can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. So then, what does cause the image to appear on the surface of the shroud? The fibrils are darkened because the cellulose molecules and the flax fibrils have been chemically altered. There are carbon atoms in the cellulose molecule which under normal circumstances share a single electron bond, but the darkened fibrils contain cellulose molecules in which the carbon atoms have a double electron bond. The question is, what can produce the net effect of the image of the shroud? We've experimentally determined that heat can induce the molecular change in the flax fibrils. However, heat cannot create shaded regions with an equal extent of fibril change, and it cannot create a 3D depth map unless we change some fibrils more than others. We have absolutely no idea how a medieval artist could have used a controlled radiation source to create the image in the shroud. In fact, we do not even possess this ability today. The previously cited result comes from simulation only, because even with our advanced technology today we cannot reproduce the image with all of the same chemical effects we observe in the shroud. In fact, so far the only process which has been able to produce all of the chemical effects of the fibrils and results in a 3D depth map of a man on the linen is radiation. But if radiation is in fact the best explanation for how the image was formed, that raises some big questions. A burst of 34,000 billion watts of VUV radiation produced a discoloration on the uppermost surface of the shroud surface, which gave rise to a perfect three-dimensional negative image. We currently do not know of any natural cause for a human corpse producing ultraviolet radiation like this. A very short and intense flash of directional VUV radiation can color the linen fabric. The total power required to instantly color the surface of linen corresponding to a human body is 34,000 billion watts. According to normal burial proceedings in the 1st century, the body, after a ritual washing, was dressed in a kittel, shroud, called takrachit, as shown in the picture. But in the case of Jesus, there was not enough time. So the shroud was probably just wrapped and laid over his body, as shown in the image above. Some researchers have suggested that the image on the shroud could only have been formed by orthogonal, unidirectional rays, which means that the light that created the image would have had to come from a single source and hit the cloth at right angles. This theory is based on the fact that the image on the shroud is only visible from a certain angle, and appears to be three-dimensional, as if it were formed by a beam of light hitting the cloth from a single point. Experiments by physicist Arthur Linde in 2017 using a cyclotron at the University of Missouri demonstrated that the radiation had to be extremely fine-tuned within a very narrow range of parameters in order to produce the image of the shroud, otherwise the shroud could have been burnt through, or if too many of the fibers had been colored it would have left only a dark area instead of an image, or if the radiation source was too weak or too far away from the cloth it would not have left any. Radiation effect. According to some biophysicists, particle radiation irradiated the shroud, and the source of the particle radiation was the body itself. The source of the illumination that had formed the image came from within, that is, from the body as a whole. In other words, the radiation did not come from some external source, rather, the radiation's origin was directly from the body, from every pinpoint location of the body. During the resurrection, the shroud probably fell through the disappearing dematerializing body while matter turned into energy. So as the body dematerialized, gravity took the shroud through the dematerializing body and fell through the body. Next, we will deal with the blood found on the shroud. Traces of human blood were found, and tests confirmed that this blood belonged to a human body at the time of death, and the blood type is most likely AB. The stains were formed by real human bleeding from real wounds on a real human body that came into direct contact with the cloth. Tests confirmed the presence of albumin, immunoglobulin, hemoglobina, and various antigens. But most interesting, the blood material also tested positive for the bile pigment bilirubin. In the context of forensic investigations, the presence of bilirubin in blood evidence could potentially be an indication of trauma or injury, including injury sustained during torture. Bilirubin may be released into the bloodstream as a result of the breakdown of red blood cells in damaged tissues, including bruising or other types of trauma. Included in these innumerable bloodstains are at least 100 tiny dumbbell-shaped scourge marks on the body and legs of the man on the shroud, which match wounds caused by a Roman flagrum with 2 lead balls on the end of each of its 3 thongs, evidently designed to cause internal bleeding so a crucifixion victim didn't die too soon of blood loss. Each of those scourge wounds has tiny blood clots which each have a serum retraction halo, clearly visible in ultraviolet light but barely visible, and some are invisible to the naked eye. Therefore, a medieval forger would not only require a modern knowledge of the physiology of clot retraction, but would have to produce images of serum rings that are clearly evident only under ultraviolet light, which was only discovered in 1801. Even to this day, no artist, physician, or scientist has ever yet been able to reproduce, or otherwise transfer such microscopic precision of wounds from a body to a different object to date, much less to accomplish this flawlessly for over 100 scourge wounds. Next, we will give a closer look to the cumulative evidence that corroborates the shroud's authenticity. In 1898, Secondo Pia, an Italian amateur photograph, took the first official photograph of the shroud. Having exposed 4 photographic plates, he returned to his studio and began the process of developing them. What Pia saw that night in his darkroom astounded him. For, as the image on the negative plate took shape before his eyes, he found himself staring at a coherent likeness of a crucified man. Instead of the flat, enigmatic image seen on the cloth, the negative plate gave the impression of a substantial figure emerging from the background, a figure that looked like a real human body. The negative revealed a remarkably convincing, 3-dimensional image of man's face, his eyelids closed. It was as if the shroud itself was a photographic negative that could be developed into a breathtaking, positive image of the crucified Jesus. Pia reported, "I experienced a very strong emotion when, during the development, I saw for the first time the holy face appear on the plate, with such clarity that I was dumbfounded by it. The image on the shroud appears as a negative image, like a negative of a photograph, and has most likely been formed by the imprint of the body that had been wrapped in the cloth after death." Then, further, in 1976 a team of American scientists led by Dr. John Jackson discovered that the shroud contains 3D information. They used a VP-8 image analyzer, which was a device originally developed by NASA to enhance images of the Moon's surface. The VP-8 image analyzer uses a mathematical algorithm to convert variations in brightness in a 2D image into height information, creating a 3D representation of the image. When Dr. Jackson and his team applied the VP-8 image analyzer to photographs of the Shroud of Turin, they discovered that the image on the shroud contained 3D information. The 3D information was particularly clear when the image was analyzed using a technique called the relief shading technique, which involves illuminating the image from different angles to create shadows that highlight variations in height. This discovery of 3D information on the Shroud of Turin was a significant breakthrough, as it provided new insights into the nature of the image and suggested that it was not a simple painting or forgery. In 2012, Thierry Castex from France made these 3D images based on the 3D information contained in the Shroud of Turin. In 2018, researchers in Padua, Italy, unveiled a 3D carbon copy of what the man on the shroud looked like based on the precise measurements of the cloth. The researchers used sophisticated 3D imaging technology to create a replica of the face on the Shroud of Turin, which they believe provides a more accurate representation of what Jesus may have looked like. The photonegative image and 3D information on the Shroud of Turin are cumulative evidence of its authenticity because they provide unique and unexplained characteristics that are difficult to replicate or explain by forgers or natural processes. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, often abbreviated as STURP, made a scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin. It was performed by an international team of experts. For 5 consecutive 24-hour days, they used the latest technology to study the front and back image. This group of experts, working together, performed the first ever in-depth, multidisciplinary scientific examination of the shroud. They produced the primary database of credible scientific information about the shroud. They published over 30 peer-reviewed scientific articles, and it has become an essential resource for the ongoing research done by every serious shroud scholar today. The shroud has become the most scientifically studied textile and artifact in human history. STURP issued its final report in 1981. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists, or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. Barry Schwartz was a member of the team. STURP issued its final report in 1981. Schwartz confessed, "At the beginning of my work, I was very skeptical about its authenticity. I felt no particular emotion toward Jesus because I was raised as an Orthodox Jew. The only thing I knew about Jesus was that he was a Jew, and this was all. After 18 years of study, the full conviction came when, the blood chemistry Alan Adler, another Jew who was part of the study group, I explained why the red blood remained on the shroud. The old blood would have to be black or brown, while the blood on the shroud is a red crimson. It seemed inexplicable. Instead, it was the last piece of the puzzle. After nearly 20 years of investigation, it was a shock for me to discover that the piece of cloth was the authentic cloth that had been wrapped the body of Jesus. The conclusions I arrived at were based exclusively on scientific observation. Could the Shroud of Turin be a forgery? The claim that the shroud is a forgery is still widely made today. Some have attempted to reproduce the image on the shroud, with more or less success. For example, Italian chemist Luigi Garlascelli tried to reproduce the image of the shroud in 2008, but the results are a far cry from the image on the shroud, as can be seen here. These reproduction attempts do not come even close to the detailed image on the shroud, and rather than proving that the shroud was a forgery, they prove that reproducing the image on the shroud is not possible by traditional known methods. In April 2022, Joanna Moorhead wrote an article for the newspaper The Guardian, The $1 Million Challenge, If the Turin Shroud is a Forgery, Show How It Was Done. She reported about David Rolfe, a filmmaker. Rolfe issued a challenge worth $1 million to the British Museum. If they believe the shroud is a medieval forgery, I call on them to repeat the exercise, and create something similar today, he said. The British Museum is less willing to get involved this time around. Any current questions about the shroud would be best put to those who currently care for it in the Royal Chapel of the Cathedral of Turin, a spokesperson said. By those that try to portray the shroud as a forgery, what is also often mentioned is the Diarcis Memorandum, which is a draft document found in the National Library of France that was fraudulently presented as a letter from Bishop Diarcis to Pope Clement VII in 1389. The document claims that the Shroud of Turin was a cleverly painted cloth exhibited in Lirey, France, and not the actual burial shroud of Jesus. However, there is no evidence to support these claims, and the document's authenticity is highly disputed. One of the chief arguments of those that claim that the shroud is not Jesus' burial cloth resorts to the radiocarbon dating that was performed on the shroud in 1988. The task for scientists was to try and find out the date of the shroud. In 1989, the prestigious scientific journal Nature published the official results of the shroud radiocarbon dating. The radiocarbon dating was one of the most eagerly awaited scientific announcements of all time. The shroud was dated by three well-known labs at the University of Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich. A radiocarbon dating test was done on a piece of cloth taken from the corner of the shroud. They declared that the results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. The result was a big surprise for many, and shocked the world. Their combined results dated the cloth to AD 1260 to 1390. They came up with a range of dates, much too wide for the small strip cut, but they reported that the cloth dated with a 95% confidence rate. If the shroud was from the 13th or 14th century, then it couldn't be the image of Jesus. There were a lot of problems with the dating, problems that are still discussed today. When the sample was taken, there was a discussion for more than an hour about from which area the sample should be taken. It was taken from a corner that experts had advised against, because a corner was missing, and it was also an area that was held often by clergy during expositions. It had also been suggested that more than one area be tested to make sure that the sample tested was representative of the whole cloth. Instead, only one sample was taken from the suspect corner and given to three different labs. Photos of the Zurich sample was given to three different textile experts in late-1999/early 2000 without telling them they were pictures of the shroud. All three said they believed the area had been manipulated or repaired. The late Stirp chemist Raymond Rogers had access to samples that were radiocarbon dated. After analyzing the samples, he had to admit what Benford and Joe Marino hypothesized was right: the original linen shroud contained additional cotton threads. The samples from the cloth that was radiocarbon dated had cotton in it. He published a science paper in 2004, concluding that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original linen of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the shroud. The raw data from the three labs, which the labs, against all norms, refused to release immediately, were finally obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2017. Careful analysis of that data supports the notion that the shroud sample dated in 1988 was a combination of 1st and 16th century cloth. In France, there was a method called French invisible reweaving, used by master weavers in the 16th century. The weaver replaces each broken thread, one at a time. Many more peer-reviewed papers have been published on the subject of the age of the shroud, coming to a different conclusion than the 1988 radiocarbon dating. A recent one from March this year, using X-ray scattering, concluded that the experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the Shroud of Turin is a 2,000-year-old relic, as supposed by Christian tradition. In November 2020, longtime Shroud of Turin researcher Joseph Marino, which together with his wife, Sue Benford, discovered that the corner that was radiocarbon dated was reweaved, published a book in which he has compiled the most comprehensive collection of data on the 1988 carbon-14 dating tests. The 800-page book reveals numerous questionable actions, errors and contradictions by both the Catholic Church and the C-14 labs before, during and after the taking of the samples. Marino believes that if the shroud is genuine, it is quite simply the most important and valuable object on the planet, since it is as close as we could ever come to proving that the death and resurrection of Jesus are historical facts. In the Cathedral of Oviedo in northern Spain is a linen cloth called the Sudarium Christi, or the face cloth of Christ. The Sudarium Christi is a poor-quality linen cloth, like a handkerchief, measuring 33 by 21 inches. Unlike the Shroud of Turin, it does not have an image. However, it does have bloodstains and serum stains from pulmonary edema fluid which match the blood and serum patterns and blood type, AB, of the Shroud of Turin. There were 3 pieces of fabric in the Passion story: the shroud, the linen strips that hold the body in the position since it was in rigor mortis, and the face cloth, the Sudarium. John chapter 20 mentions a napkin or a face cloth that was used to wrap the face of Jesus and was found in the tomb on Resurrection Sunday. We have very good reasons to believe that the Sudarium of Oviedo is the face cloth of Jesus since it has a very well-documented paper trail. It was in Judea until 614 AD when it was taken to Alexandria, then to Cartagena and spent the next 100 years in Sevilla and Toledo, and then in 718 AD it entered the region of Oviedo and it's still housed in a church in Oviedo today. The Code of Jewish law declared that the final blood coming from the body at the moment of death considered that life was in the blood, and according to this anything which contains the lifeblood should be buried with the body so as not to separate the body from the lifeblood. So the Sudarium likely covered Jesus' head while he was being removed from the cross in order to collect all the blood flowing from his head. So while Jesus was being removed from the cross, some blood would have wiped from Jesus' head and would have therefore been considered a carrier of lifeblood, and that's precisely why we should expect the Sudarium to be in the tomb even if separate from the body in the shroud. The cloth was wrapped all the way around the head and most probably tied in a knot at the top, and then when the body reached the tomb what most probably happened was this cloth could have just been very easily lifted off the head. The Sudarium was removed, and the deceased was covered with a shroud, and it remained near the deceased until somebody recovered it. There's a significant amount of dirt and pollen on the Sudarium. Dirt samples and pollen species match those sampled from Judea, North Africa and Spain, supporting the documented paper trail of the Sudarium. In fact, the dirt matches samples taken specifically from the area around Calvary where Jesus was crucified. Swiss criminologist Max Frey found 16 types of pollen in the Sudarium of Oviedo and identified at least 9 of them growing in Palestine. Some of the traces found on the Sudarium as well as in the Shroud of Turin have their origin in the burial substances used for the entombment. In fact, helichrysum pollen would have been present in oils and ointments because helichrysum oil is only produced from the pressing of fresh flowers and it is not an airborne pollen. The Sudarium also contains stains of both blood and fluid. The blood is human type AB, the same as found on the shroud. The fluid is pleural edema, a fluid that develops in the lungs of those who die of asphyxiation when the bodies are jolted. This fluid can come out of the nostrils. Furthermore, the fluid stains show signs of drying between additional fluid discharges, meaning the body underwent multiple rounds of movement after the Sudarium had wrapped the head. Based on this evidence, forensic analysis has concluded that the Sudarium of Oviedo wrapped the head of a person who died of asphyxiation. The person's nose was 8 centimeters long, which happens to be identical to the shroud, and the blood points originated at the exact same locations as on the shroud. So if we do a quick summary of the comparison between the Sudarium and the shroud, we find that the blood type is identical, the facial geometry is nearly identical, and the blood origin points are identical. They both contain significant amounts of dirt and pollen from non-European locations, so it is rational to conclude that both cloths wrapped the same body. Next, let's give a closer look at the botanical evidence on the Shroud of Turin. Botanical investigation of the shroud began with Max Frey's 1973 observations of pollen grains on the shroud, which he sampled by means of sticky tape. Frey took a second set of 27 sticky tape samples from the shroud during the scientific study in 1978. The presence on the shroud of pollen of 29 plants of the Near East, and especially of 21 plants that grow in the desert or the steppes, directly leads to the hypothesis that the shroud, now preserved in Turin, in the past was exposed to open air in countries where these plants are part of the normal vegetation. Of the 58 species of pollen on the shroud, 55 of them grow in Jerusalem and only 3 species of pollen do not grow in either Europe or Jerusalem. Those 3 species of pollen are local to regions of Urfa, which used to be called Odessa and Constantinople. Botanist Avinoam Danon of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem began collaborating with shroud researchers in 1995. He determined the origin of the shroud based on a comprehensive analysis of pollen taken from the shroud. The analysis positively identified a high density of pollen of the thistle Gundelia tournifortii, which blooms in Israel between March and May for millennia. It has been that this is the plant used for the crown of thorns on Jesus' head. 2 pollen grains of this species were also found on the Siderium of Oviedo, described previously. The pollen evidence shows that the shroud contains botanical substances used in anointing and embalming during funeral and burial rites in ancient times. The exact identification of the syndonic most abundant pollen of the Helichrysum, along with the presence of the cistus, the ferula and pistacia, reveals the use of ointments. These plants were typically employed in expensive and valuable products cited in the scientific writings of Pliny the Elder. Our conclusions show that the relic could be a real burial cloth, yielding evidence of pollen, which are the bases of ancient ointments used in the 1st century AD. The corpse kept in the shroud received a funeral and burial with all the honor and respect that would have been customary in the Hebrew tradition. The largest amount of Helichrysum pollen originates from the form used to produce its oil, utilizing exclusively fresh flowers. In October 1978, the Shroud of Turin project took 32 samples of surface material by pressing a specially formulated sticky tape onto the shroud. Some crystals of calcium carbonate, limestone, were found on some of the tapes. There are limestone particles on the shroud, especially around the area of the feet. It was discovered that they were of the comparatively rare travertine aragonite variety of calcium carbonate rather than the more common calcite. From their spectral patterns, it was clear that the shroud and Jerusalem tomb limestone samples were very close match. The Shroud of Turin is made of a type of linen known as a herringbone weave, which is not commonly used in modern textiles. The type of flax used in the Shroud of Turin is a species native to the Middle East and is believed to have been widely cultivated and used for thousands of years for a variety of purposes, including the production of linen fabric. We read in the Gospel of Mark, when Pilate was informed by the centurion, he gave the body to Joseph. After Joseph bought a linen cloth and took down the body, he wrapped it in the linen and placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock. A few other ancient textiles made on 4-harness looms and found in the Near East, like in En-Gedi, can also be regarded as analogues of the burial garment from Turin. There is physical evidence which corroborates that the linen cloth is 2,000 years old. For example, the spinning wheel had become a standard piece of equipment in Europe by the 13th century. However, the threads on the shroud were not produced on the spinning wheel, they are hand-spun. In 1989, an expert in early Syriac, Ian Dickinson, of Canterbury, England, realized that the shroud's 437 by 111 centimeters dimensions are, to the nearest centimeter, exactly 8 by 2 Assyrian standard cubits of 21.6 inches. The Assyrian standard cubit was the international measure of commerce prevailing in Jesus's time, including among the Jews. A medieval artist/forger would be most unlikely to know the length of the standard cubit of Jesus' day, as this was only discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. The side strip is a strip of linen about 8 centimeters, or 3.5 inches wide along its left-hand side of the shroud, looking at it with its frontal image in the lower half and the man upright, and joined by a single seam. The strip is incomplete at each end, with 14 centimeters, or 5.5 inches, and 36 centimeters, or 14 inches missing at the bottom and top left-hand corners respectively. The side strip is made from the same piece of cloth as the shroud, since unique irregularities in the weave of the main body of the shroud extend across the side strip. In the year 2000, a very special, almost invisible stitching with which the edges were finished, which is visible only on the shroud's underside, was discovered. Only once before an essentially identical type of stitching has been found, that in 1st century textiles at Masada, the Jewish fortress overrun by the Romans in AD 73 and never occupied again. So from a historical analysis, the manufacturing method of the thread, the weave of the linen, the fabric dimensions and the stitch of the side strip are all incompatible with the medieval origin, yet aligned perfectly with the 1st century Judean origin. At a microscopic level we find cotton fibers among the linen thread, specifically a cotton species called Gossypium herbicum. This particular species of cotton does not grow in Europe but rather in the Middle East and Africa. Not a single piece of physical evidence is consistent with the medieval European origin, yet every single piece of evidence aligns perfectly with a 1st century Judean origin, which means that the physical evidence deposited on the shroud is completely incompatible with the medieval forgery hypothesis and instead points exclusively to the authenticity of the shroud. Let's give a closer look at the history of the Shroud of Turin. The first confirmed historical appearance of the shroud was in 1353 in Lirey, France. It was in the possession of a French knight. And so the first, almost universally recognized, historical documents related to the shroud date back to the same period. A reliable historical root of the shroud is that it was stored in the 1st century in the Middle East, maybe Jerusalem. From 200 to 944 AD it was exhibited several times in Edessa. From 944 it was publicly displayed in Constantinople till the Fourth Crusade in 1204. It is possible that the shroud was taken from Constantinople during the sack and was subsequently sold or traded. Some historians believe that the shroud may have been acquired by the Knights Templar, a military order that was active during this time period. The shroud re-emerged in the historical record in 1353 when it was displayed in a church in Lirey, France. Several 2nd century Christian writings record that the shroud had been saved from Jesus' tomb. We find Pilate examining 4 soldiers as to their statement that the body of Jesus was stolen. 1. The second, the testimony of the first is gone, says the 11 apostles took the body. The third says, Joseph and Nicodemus. The fourth, we were asleep. They are imprisoned, and Pilate goes with the centurion and the priests to the tomb and finds the grave clothes. He says, if the body had been stolen, these would have been taken too. They say, these grave clothes belong to someone else. Pilate remembers the words of Jesus, great wonders must happen in my tomb, and goes in, and weeps over the shroud. Then he turns to the centurion, who had but one eye, having lost the other in battle. When the Christians of the city of Edessa, today in Turkey, wrote their history in the 3rd century, they claimed that the gospel had arrived in the city during the 1st century, brought by a disciple of Jesus named Adai and delivered to King Abgar V, a contemporary of Christ. Later, a Syriac writer expanded upon this text, resulting in the teaching of Adai. Within this expanded text, there is a small passage in which Abgar, who is corresponding with Jesus through a messenger named Hanan, requests that a picture of Jesus be made. Hanan took and painted the portrait of Jesus and brought it with him to his lord King Abgar. When King Abgar saw the portrait he received it with great joy and placed it with great honor in one of the buildings of his palaces. This is the first time when the so-called image of Edessa is mentioned. And it is the only known reference to it in ancient times. While the existence of the Edessa image in ancient times remains a matter of debate, many scholars agree that there is enough proof for its existence in the 6th century. The first truly historical reference we have to the image of Odessa comes in the year 544 AD. The Persian king Khosrows laid siege to the city of Odessa. A city was able to repel the attack. In his account of the siege, historian Evragius Scholasticus recounts how the town was saved through the miraculous assistance of the divinely made image not made by the hands of man. This phrase is often used to describe the image of Odessa. As an interesting side note, during the early centuries of Christianity, before 544 AD, Jesus was mostly depicted with short hair and no beard. Artists portrayed Jesus in a variety of different styles. However, the most common depiction of Jesus during this time was that of a youthful, beardless figure with a Hellenistic Roman appearance. This particular portrayal of Jesus was heavily influenced by the cultural and artistic trends of the time, as well as the theological and philosophical beliefs of the early Christian Church. The depiction of Christ in the Hinton St. Mary mosaic in England from the 4th century AD, for example, presents him as a conventional, beardless young man with a Hellenistic Roman appearance. That started to change in the 6th century, after 544 AD, and became more prevalent during the Byzantine era. Dr. Alan Wanger developed a method of overlaying images in different light polarizations to find what he calls points of congruence and published the technique in the journal Optics. This technique has now been widely adopted in the U.S. courts, with anywhere from 45 to 60 points of congruence between two images being sufficient to prove common identity in the U.S. court of law. When this technique was applied to a comparison between the Shroud of Turin and the St. Catherine Christ Pantocrator, dated 550 AD, the technique returned 250 points of congruence, and this is a known 6th century piece of art. Even creases and wrinkles on the shroud cloth have been rendered by the artist. Like the lines in the neck, these lines don't serve any purpose, they don't refer to anything anatomical, and they're even awkwardly forged under the image. In some cases it makes no sense why these marks would be included, unless of course these artists were copying from the Shroud of Turin, which does have this mark, likely due to a defect or a fold around the beard. Even comparing the Shroud of Turin to a Byzantine Justinian II solidus coin results in 188 points of congruence, and this is a known 7th century coin. In 639 AD, Muslims conquered Odessa but allowed the Christians to continue to pay the jizya and celebrate their Christian traditions, including the veneration of the image. In 943 AD, the Byzantine emperor started negotiations with Muslim rulers in Odessa in an effort to obtain the image of Odessa and add it to his collection of relics in Constantinople. He offered immunity from attack, 12,000 pieces of silver, and the release of 200 Muslim prisoners, all in exchange for the image of Odessa. The Muslim leaders accepted the offer in 944. And on August 15, 944 AD, the image of Odessa arrived in Constantinople, and the event is commemorated in the image titled The Surrender of the Mandylion. Between 944 AD and 1204, the Mandylion was kept in the city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, which was then the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine emperors considered the Mandylion to be one of their most sacred relics, and it was kept in the imperial palace along with other important religious objects. We have also one of the most famous references to the burial cloth of Jesus, which is called the Hungarian Prey manuscript, which is reliably dated to AD 1192 to 1195. Because of the historical details, it relates. That is about 70 years prior to the 1260 to 1390 date range assigned to the shroud by the 3 radiocarbon lab tests from 1988. The top portion of the image shows Jesus with his arms and hands placed in the same pose as seen on the shroud. In 4 places an L-shaped set of burns appears on the shroud. These are damage from before the first known fire of 1532. The burns are often called the poker holes. They are one of the most revealing similarities between the Prey manuscript and the Shroud of Turin. The shroud was woven in a herringbone pattern, a distinctive V-shaped weaving pattern. The image of the Prey manuscript shows, in a primitive style, that pattern of the fabric. As mentioned earlier, there was the Fourth Crusade, which took place between 1202 and 1204, a military campaign launched by Western European Christians with the aim of capturing the city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. On that occasion, Constantinople was sacked, and the Mandylion disappeared, to reappear in 1353, in Lirae, France. The last point to be addressed in this presentation is, how did Jesus look like? As mentioned earlier, the first photograph in 1898 by Secondo Pia was a milestone in unraveling the secrets of the shroud. The next was to extract 3D information. But the last has remained surprisingly elusive. How did Jesus in real life look like? Based on the image of the man on the Shroud of Turin, many attempts have been made to recreate how Jesus might have looked like. In the image, we see a few examples. The results were more and less successful. But in my view, none came really close. Then, in November, last year, I took this image of the face on the Shroud of Turin, and searched a photo sharpening tool on the internet. And I obtained this computer-generated image, which encouraged me to continue experiments. After several months, I think I have achieved a very close approximation of how the man on the shroud most likely looked like. It is quite remarkable and astonishing, that from a faint, almost invisible image, we have been able, using advanced computer tools, to recreate the image of Jesus.
This video presentation is available as a PowerPoint slideshow. You will find in the description of this video the link to download it. This video accompanies the 2-volume book, Confirming Yeshua. The first volume, as a paperback, with 493 pages, and the second with 414 pages. Both are available as well in Kindle format. The books can be purchased online at Amazon, with links for purchase in the description. If you enjoyed the content, please give it a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Shalom and blessings.